The wind was a thief, a hollow-voiced predator that stole the warmth from Anna's bones and the hope from her heart. It swept down from the granite peaks, a relentless, scouring force that stripped the last stubborn leaves from the aspen and left the pines groaning in their deep-rooted sleep. Every gust was a reminder of their dwindling time, a whisper of the coming white death of winter. Anna pulled the thin wool of her mother's shawl tighter around her shoulders, the fabric worn to a fragile web, offering more memory than comfort. Beside her, Lena moved with the same hunched posture, her face a pale, determined mask against the biting air. They were mirrors of each other, two halves of a single desperation, their movement synchronized by 18 years of shared existence and 2 months of shared grief. Their world had shrunk to this, the ache of hunger, the burn of cold, and the ceaseless search for anything that would burn. Their meager pile of scavenged branches was pathetic, a child's collection of twigs that would barely last the night. The axe they shared, its handle smooth and dark from their father's hands, felt impossibly heavy. Each swing into a deadfall limb sent a jarring shock through Anna's tired arms, a painful echo in the vast, uncaring silence of the mountainside. The sun was a weak, silver coin in a sky the color of slate, offering light but no heat. It was sinking fast, dragging the temperature down with it. They had to turn back soon, back to the crumbling lean-to that mocked the memory of a home, a place where the wind slipped through the chinks like a phantom, leaving frost on their blankets. Anna watched her sister push a tangle of frozen thorns aside with a booted foot, her breath pluming in the frigid air. There was no complaint, no word of despair. There never was. They had packed their sorrow away with their parents' few belongings, burying it deep beneath the immediate, crushing need to simply live through another day. Lena suddenly stopped, her head cocked at an angle. She stood frozen, a silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. Anna paused, her own breath held captive in her chest, listening. But there was nothing but the eternal sigh of the wind through the high rocks and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk. She took a step closer, her boots crunching on the frost-hardened ground. Lena didn't turn. She was staring at the ground near the base of a gnarled, ancient juniper that clung to the mountainside like a claw. It wasn't the tree that held her gaze, but the earth beneath it. A peculiar darkness, a patch of shadow that seemed to drink the fading light. "What is it?" Anna's voice was a dry rasp, swallowed by the wind almost before it left her lips. Lena gestured with a mittened hand, a slow, deliberate movement. "The ground," she whispered, her voice tight. "It feels hollow." Anna knelt, brushing away a skiff of dry pine needles and loose scree. Her fingers, numb with cold, met not solid, frozen earth, but the sharp edge of rock. It wasn't a loose stone. It was a lip, a defined border. Together, they clawed at the dirt and debris, their movements becoming frantic as the shape revealed itself. It was a crack, a fissure in the bedrock no wider than a man's shoulders, obscured by the juniper's low-hanging boughs and years of accumulated detritus. A puff of air, strangely still and smelling of deep, damp earth and stone, breathed out from the opening, a stark contrast to the restless gale that whipped around them. It wasn't the scent of an animal's den, not the rank smell of fox or bear. It was something else. Something ancient and undisturbed. A silence that felt deeper than silence. They looked at each other, their shared thought passing between them in the grey light. Fear was a cold knot in Anna's stomach, but it was overshadowed by a desperate, burgeoning curiosity. In a world that had offered them nothing but hardship, this fissure felt like a secret, a question posed by the mountain itself. They stood over the dark opening for a long moment, the wind tearing at their hair and clothes, urging them back toward the failure of their shelter. But the strange stillness from the earth held them fast. It was a choice, stark and immediate. The known misery of the lean-to, or the terrifying unknown of the dark. Lena looked at Anna, her blue eyes, so like her own, reflecting the last of the day's light. No words were needed. Anna gave a single, sharp nod. They returned to their pathetic pile of firewood, retrieving the nearly spent lantern and the small tin of matches they guarded so carefully. With trembling fingers, Anna struck a match, cupping the fragile flame against the wind until the wick caught, casting a weak, sputtering yellow glow. The light seemed frail, an insignificant spark against the immensity of the coming night and the profound darkness of the fissure. Lena went first, holding the lantern. She lowered herself into the crack, her boots scraping against unseen rock. For a moment her head and shoulders were visible, haloed by the lantern's glow, and then she was gone, the light sinking with her, pulling the world down into blackness. Anna's heart hammered against her ribs. The wind howled a warning, a mournful cry that seemed to claw at her, trying to pull her back from the precipice. She ignored it, her focus entirely on the faint circle of light far below. Its slopes, Lena's voice echoed up, thin and strange, stripped of the wind's influence. It's a passage, not a drop. Taking a deep breath that tasted of pine and ice, Anna followed. The transition was instantaneous and absolute. One moment she was in the wild, open world of wind and sky, the next, she was swallowed by the earth. The roaring of the gale was sliced away, replaced by a heavy, profound silence that pressed in on her ears. The air was cold, but a still, subterranean cold, without the wind's bite. It smelled of wet stone, of minerals, of time itself. The passage was narrow, the rock pressing close on either side, its surface slick with a thin film of moisture that gleamed in the lantern light. They moved slowly, cautiously, their descent guided by the uneven floor that angled steadily downward into the heart of the mountain. The narrow, claustrophobic passage continued for what felt like an eternity, a slow, shuffling journey into the planet's core. The only sounds were their own ragged breaths and the soft scuff of their boots on the stone floor. The lantern flame danced and swayed, casting their elongated shadows against the weeping rock walls, making them look like ghostly giants. Anna kept one hand on the wall beside her, the stone cold and unyielding, an anchor in the disorienting darkness. The air grew heavier, the scent of damp earth deepening, and then, just as the oppressive closeness began to feel permanent, the passage changed. The walls fell away. Lena, a few steps ahead, stopped so abruptly that Anna almost collided with her. She raised the lantern high, and the small, flickering flame seemed to shrink, utterly defeated by the sheer scale of the space that had opened before them. They stood on a wide ledge at the entrance to a cavern so vast its ceiling was lost in an impenetrable blackness far above. The lantern's light was a tiny, fragile island in an ocean of dark, revealing only a fraction of the immense chamber. It illuminated a floor of smooth, pale stone and the bases of colossal pillars of rock that rose like the trunks of petrified trees, disappearing into the unseen heights. The silence here was different. It was a living thing, a deep, resonant hum that seemed to be the mountain's own slumbering breath. And within that silence, there was another sound, faint but clear, the gentle, rhythmic drip of water. They followed the sound, their footsteps echoing in the immense space. In the center of the cavern floor, they found it. A steady, musical plink of water falling from a single stalactite high above, landing in a perfectly clear pool that had formed in a natural stone basin. The water was pure and achingly cold. Anna dipped her fingers in, the shock of it a welcome, tangible sensation. Here was water, sheltered from the frost. Here was a fortress of stone, impervious to the wind. Here was a silence that felt not like emptiness, but like safety. A profound, bone-deep sense of sanctuary settled over her, a feeling she hadn't known since she'd sat by her mother's hearth. They made their way back up the sloping passage, emerging from the fissure into a world that seemed alien and hostile. The wind, which had been a constant companion, now felt like a physical assault, its fury amplified after the profound stillness below. Night had fallen completely, and a million sharp, diamond-hard stars glittered in a sky of black velvet. The cold was a living entity, sinking its teeth deep into their flesh. The linter, visible as a dark smudge against the snow-dusted ground, looked more fragile and pathetic than ever. Shivering, they huddled together behind the juniper tree, the lantern set between them, its light flickering wildly in the gale. "We can't stay out here," Lena said, her voice low and certain. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, an acknowledgement that their old life, the one of struggling under the open sky, was over. Anna looked from the frail shelter to the dark slit in the earth. One was a slow, certain death by freezing. The other was a terrifying, uncertain chance at life. But the memory of the cavern, its stillness, its sheer, solid permanence, was a powerful lure. It was a fortress, a tomb, a womb. Whatever it was better than this. No, Anna agreed, her own voice firm despite the chattering of her teeth. We can't. The decision, once made, settled a strange calm over them. The path ahead was no less difficult, but for the first time in months, it was a path. They didn't even bother to spend one last night in the lean-to. Their meager belongings were few and easily carried. 2 bedrolls, thin and patched. A heavy iron pot. The axe. A small sack containing a handful of dried beans, a half-used block of salt, and a few precious strips of dried venison. They gathered everything, their movements economical and sure, a silent dance of shared purpose. The final trip down into the earth was different. This was not an exploration, it was a migration. They were leaving the world behind. As Anna took one last look at the star-dusted peaks and the wind-scoured landscape, a pang of sorrow hit her, a farewell to the sun and the sky. Then she turned her back on it all and followed Lena's light down into the waiting dark. Their first priority was fire. The subterranean air, while still, held a deep, penetrating chill that seemed to emanate from the very stones themselves. Warmth was life, and without it, even this fortress would become their tomb. The next morning, they ascended to the surface, blinking in the harsh, pale light of dawn. The world above was rimed with frost, every surface glittering with a cruel beauty. They didn't wander far from the crevice, their search for materials guided by a new and urgent purpose. They needed stone, flat and solid, to build a hearth and a chimney that could draw the smoke away. They found a rock slide on a nearby slope, a tumble of slate and granite that offered a wealth of building materials. The work was brutal. They pried stones loose, their fingers raw and bleeding, and carried them, one by one, back to the fissure. The largest stones required both of them, a staggering, stumbling effort, their muscles screaming in protest. They lowered the stones into the cavern with a length of rope they had salvaged, a slow, painstaking process that consumed the entire day. Down in the cavern, they chose a spot against a flat, sheer wall of rock, a natural backsplash for their hearth. They mixed the cavern's clay-like soil with water from the pool to create a crude but effective mortar. Anna laid the stones while Lena mixed the mud, their hands and clothes becoming caked in the cold, wet earth. They worked in the flickering lantern light, their movements casting huge, dancing shadows across the cavern walls. There was no art to it, only function. A heavy base, thick walls, a carefully angled flue that they directed towards a smaller, higher fissure they had discovered in the cavern wall, a natural chimney to the outside world. It took them 3 days. 3 days of hauling rock, mixing mud, and stacking stones until their bodies ached with a fatigue so deep it felt permanent. On the evening of the 3rd day, it was done. A squat, solid structure of rock and mud stood against the wall, a testament to their sheer will. With trembling hands, Lena laid a small pile of dry twigs and bark inside the hearth. Anna struck the match. The flame caught, licking at the kindling, and a plume of smoke, thin at first, then thicker, curled upwards and was drawn, miraculously, into the flue. A moment later, a warm, orange light pushed back the immense darkness, and the scent of wood smoke filled the air. They collapsed onto the stone floor before it, their faces illuminated by the first fire of their new home, and for the first time in a long, long time, they felt the deep, penetrating chill begin to recede. With the fire providing a steady, life-giving heart to their subterranean world, their next task was to build a shelter within the shelter. The cavern was a shield against the wind, but its sheer size meant the air remained cold away from the immediate circle of the fire. They needed a small, enclosed space they could heat efficiently, a proper room to hold the warmth and keep out the damp chill. This meant they needed wood, and a great deal of it. They found a small, sheltered copse of lodgepole pines in a ravine a half-mile from the crevice, trees that had been protected from the worst of the winds. The axe, once a tool for scavenging firewood, now became a tool of creation. The sharp, rhythmic crack of the blade against wood echoed in the crisp mountain air, a sound of deliberate industry. Felling the trees was hard, but hauling the logs back to the fissure was a Herculean task. They would work together, dragging each log through the snow-dusted undergrowth, their muscles straining, their breath clouding in front of them. Getting the logs down the narrow passage was an engineering puzzle. They used their rope, lowering them end over end, a dangerous, clumsy process that required all their combined strength and coordination. Down in the cavern, a pile of pale, stripped logs began to grow beside the fire. They chose a space near the hearth, using the cavern's back wall as the fourth wall of their cabin. With the axe and a smaller handsaw, they began the slow process of notching the logs. It was a skill their father had known, and they replicated it through memory and instinct, their hands learning the feel of the wood, the precise angle of the cuts. Days blurred into a steady rhythm of labor, ascend to the cold, bright world, fell and haul the timber, descend into the firelit dark, and build. They worked in silence, their communication consisting of nods, gestures, and the shared understanding of the task at hand. The walls rose slowly, one log at a time, the pale wood a stark contrast to the dark, ancient stone behind it. They filled the gaps with a mixture of dried moss and the clay-like mud, creating a surprisingly sturdy and well-insulated wall. They left openings for a single door and a small window that would face the fire. It was a crude, simple structure, but as it took shape, it transformed the cavern from a mere refuge into a home. It was a space that was wholly theirs, built by their own hands, a small pocket of order and warmth carved directly out of the wild, indifferent rock. As the last log of the roof was set in place, a new anxiety began to creep into Anna's thoughts, a cold fear that had nothing to do with the temperature. Winter was no longer coming, it was here. A permanent, deep freeze had settled over the mountains, and the time for foraging was running out. While one of them worked on finishing the cabin, weaving a door from saplings, smoothing the mud between the logs, the other would take their sack and venture out, racing against the fading light. The world outside had become a place of stark, minimalist beauty. The vibrant greens and golds of autumn were gone, replaced by a monochrome palette of white snow, black rock, and grey sky. Food was scarce, hidden beneath the snow. They dug for cattail roots in the frozen marsh at the base of the mountain, their fingers growing numb as they broke through the ice. They gathered the last of the rose hips, shriveled and frozen on their thorny branches, but full of tart, life-sustaining energy. Lena, who had a patient and steady hand, became adept at setting simple snares along rabbit trails. A successful catch was a rare and precious victory, providing not only meat to be smoked and preserved by their fire, but also a soft pelt to add to their bedding. Anna focused on gathering what plants she could identify from her mother's teachings. Tough, bitter yarrow for tea, the inner bark of pines to be dried and ground into a rough flour, and hardy lichen scraped from the windward side of rocks. Every meager find was brought back to the cavern and carefully stored in a small, dry alcove they designated as their larder. They hung strips of rabbit meat near the fire to smoke, the savory scent a constant, tantalizing promise. They laid roots out on flat stones to dry, and bundled herbs to hang from the new cabin's rafters. The larder grew slowly, its contents a testament to their tireless effort. It was nowhere near enough to see them through a long winter with ease, but it was something. It was a buffer against starvation, a small hoard of life wrested from a dying landscape. Anna would often pause in her work to look at their collection, the neat piles of roots and the strings of dried meat, and feel a fierce, protective pride. Each item was a day of survival earned, a small victory in their quiet, desperate war against the coming cold. The first great storm arrived without warning. One afternoon, the grey sky thickened and lowered, and a few lazy snowflakes began to drift down. Within an hour, the air was a blinding, churning torrent of white. The wind, which had been a constant companion, rose to a terrifying, shrieking crescendo, a physical force that hammered against the mountain. Anna and Lena were caught out, halfway back from a foraging trip, and had to fight their way back to the crevice, bent double against the gale, the snow stinging their faces like thrown sand. They stumbled down into the passage, gasping, their clothes and hair caked with snow, and the moment they were below the surface, the world fell silent. The raging blizzard, the screaming wind, the entire elemental fury of the storm was gone, replaced by the profound, muffled quiet of the cavern. It was a truly shocking transition. They sealed the entrance to the fissure as best they could with a large, flat stone and a pile of hides, and retreated to their small wooden cabin within the rock. Inside, the fire in the stone hearth crackled merrily, its light casting a warm, dancing glow on the log walls. The air was filled with the gentle scent of pine smoke and drying herbs. They shed their wet outer layers and huddled on their bed of pine boughs and rabbit pelts, listening. They could feel the storm more than hear it, a faint, deep vibration through the stone, the mountain shuddering under the assault. But inside their sanctuary, there was only peace. The vast, silent darkness of the greater cavern surrounded their little box of light and warmth, an impenetrable shield. For days they were sealed in, prisoners in their own fortress. They rationed their food, slept, and spoke little, content to sit by the fire and watch the flames. The sense of isolation was absolute. They were utterly alone, buried in the heart of a mountain while the world above was being remade in ice and snow. But it was not a frightening isolation. It was a profound security, a feeling of being completely and totally safe. They had built this. This warmth, this light, this life. The storm that would have undoubtedly killed them in their old lean-to was now nothing more than a distant rumor, a faint tremor in the rock beneath them. They had not merely found a shelter, they had created a new world for themselves, a tiny, self-contained universe of warmth and survival. When the vibrations in the stone finally ceased and the profound silence returned to its normal, placid state, they waited another full day before daring to venture out. Pushing aside the stone that covered the entrance to the fissure was difficult, a heavy drift of snow had piled against it. When they finally broke through, they were met with a sight of stunning, blinding purity. The world was gone. In its place was a landscape of impossible, brilliant white, sculpted by the wind into fantastic crests and deep, shadowed valleys. The sky was a piercing, cloudless blue, and the sun on the snow was so bright it made their eyes ache. The air was perfectly still and so cold it felt sharp in their lungs, like breathing in powdered glass. Their mountain, their entire world, was buried and asleep. They stood there for a long time on the lip of their hidden home, two small, dark figures in an immense, silent, white wilderness. There was no sign of life anywhere, not a track, not a bird, not a whisper of wind. The world had been wiped clean. They returned to the warmth of the cavern, their faces still tingling from the fierce, clean cold. The contrast was more stark than ever before, the dead, frozen world of white above, and their living, breathing world of fire and shadow below. That evening, as they sat before the hearth, a sense of quiet accomplishment settled over Anna. It wasn't triumph, not a feeling of victory over the mountain or the winter. It was something deeper, more fragile. It was the simple, profound realization that they were still alive. They had faced the end of everything they had ever known, they had been left with nothing, and they had not surrendered. They had worked and bled and feared, and they had built this life from the rock and wood of the mountain itself. Anna looked at Lena, her sister's face softened by the firelight, her expression calm and peaceful. The same strength she saw in Lena's face, she knew, must be reflected in her own. They were not just survivors. They were builders. The future remained a vast, unknown territory, a landscape as blank and intimidating as the snow-covered world outside. The winter would be long, and their resources were finite. But for now, in this moment, they were warm, they were fed, and they were safe. They were together. And in the deep, silent heart of the mountain, that fragile, hard-won hope was more than enough. It was everything.